Welcome to Pushcast. I'm your host, Oliver Heute. Today we've got two fascinating guests in the studio, a doctor and a professor. The topic, the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century. You won't believe there were 3 coups within a space of a few years. One successful one, a failed one, and yet another successful one. It led to a military dictatorship, a world war, and a James Bond-style exit. Furthermore, we ask why even bother with a parliament, but we also try to answer the question of how the protagonists viewed today. 3 of them very controversial characters and accused of genocide abroad. Lots to talk about and just a bit more than an hour time. Let's get right into it.
Hello, I'm Dr. Tez Young-Turks. Tez is fine, Oliver, as you know.
Tez, man of silver, I think.
Or a thesis as well.
Okay, yeah. And I'm here as Dr. Adrian Jones, a former Associate Professor of History at La Trobe University.
Adrian, I assume you speak Turkish?
I speak bad Turkish. That is, I always, as a foreigner, I'm very much an Anglo kind of guy. With a name like Jones, how can you be anything other? But I learnt it as a young man beside Turkish immigrants in Saturday morning school because you couldn't learn it any other way in Melbourne at that time. I still don't think there's only one place where you can learn Turkish at a university, and that's at the ANU in Canberra.
But that is very true, yes.
And that's the one place in Australia where there are hardly any Turks.
Well,
Yes, that's the irony.
Which is an irony because that's what the Turkish ambassador wanted. He wanted them to have the class right there close to him so he could kind of look over it a bit.
can you tell us what the geographics were like? So what was the size of this empire? I assume I can call it an empire still at that stage?
So you've got an Ottoman Empire that's in retreat since the late 17th century, early 18th century. So we're talking about from the failure of the siege of Vienna in 1683. So that's a moment where Ottoman power has twice attacked the gates of Vienna. It's such a powerful empire in 1526 and again in 1683 that it can deploy an army up the Danube and actually attack effectively, frighteningly, Vienna. And that's what gives us the croissant, because they baked the croissant in Vienna to celebrate the victory over the crescent. That's why it's shaped like a crescent. And you have this amazingly creative dynasty called the Ottomans, which comes from the Italian to the English and to the Greek, Othmani. So that's why we call them Ottomans, whereas they called themselves
Osmanlı.
Osman.
Which is also a common surname, or is that just a noble family that has that name?
It's the dynasty's name. They're the House of Osman. So at the end of the beginning of the breakup of the Byzantine Empire, you have Turks arriving in the 11th century, and then they form various beyliks, sub-principalities, and the Seljuks are the strongest, and then they fracture after the confrontation with the Mongols or Central Asian Turks. And then you have the Osmanlı as one particular group, which is very effective in northwestern Anatolia, around what we would call Bursa.
Bursa, yeah.
Yeah, and in the hinterland of Bursa.
That was one question I had that I couldn't answer during my research. Did the Ottoman Empire have one royal family the whole period through, or was there also struggles within the empire between different families? Is it similar to Western cultures? Or
It's a very good question, Oliver, and it depends on what answer and what period I would give you, because the Ottoman Empire was governed by the Sultan, and the Sultan, if we think about it in kind of modern nationalist, racist terms, there was always a question mark over the Sultan because he was the product of the union of the previous Sultan with a slave captive woman in the harem. So the ethnogenesis, if we take it that way, might well be half Caucasian, half Circassian, half Bosnian, half Greek.
Serbian.
Yes, exactly. So if we were looking at it from a kind of late 19th century racist ethnic frame of mind, and if I was a Turkish-minded person, very narrow-minded Turk, then I might say, well, they're not us. They're a bit classier than us. That's what they think anyway. And certainly, if you asked an Ottoman at the end of the 19th century and said to them, "Are you a Turk?" they would bristle and say, "No, I am an Ottoman." And that meant that they were exquisitely educated in all of the important Islamic languages and in European language, typically. They might well have been born in Bosnia or northern Greece, like Mustafa Kemal or Enver Pasha, people we're going to talk about today, both born in what we would call Greece.
Adrian touched upon something very important when we discuss the key figures of these events.
Yeah.
The key figures are born in what we'd know in the Balkans or Eastern Europe, obviously part of the Ottoman Empire now. But in today's terms, they were born, they were product of the empire being in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, before we dig in a little deeper, so Turkish then is not equivalent to Ottoman.
No, a typical Ottoman official, if you talk to him, if you were from the village in Anatolia or whatever, speaking pure Turkish, you would have the utmost difficulty understanding a thing he said because it was overwritten by this exquisitely highly educated Arabic and Persian. And if you became a top official in the Topkapi Palace in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you could spout the most beautiful Arabic poetry, call the prayer in the most exquisite fashion. And so you had all these highly developed skills that were utterly irrelevant to a Turkish village.
So we spoke about the ethnic part. So I think there's a 19th, 20th century understanding of it, which is, ethnicities, nationalism, which I think also is part of the story of why the whole thing came apart. And likewise, why it worked for so long, because that nationalism was not a key factor. However, what was around the whole time was religion. So I've got a book here, not yours, unfortunately, but it's called Ottomans, Khans, Caesars, and Caliphs. Caliphate is always related to that. Islam, how important, and again, it's a long period we're talking about, but maybe that time, the second half of the 19th century, how important was religion, Islam at the time, and how did it treat the other religions?
So this is part of the reform process, and we have to see these putschs that we're going to discuss in 1908, 1909, 1913. But basically they're discussing whether the old traditional Ottoman formula is relevant anymore. And in a way, the regime in the 19th century had given up on it. They'd had a series of colossal defeats since the Siege of Vienna in 1683, right through the 18th century, losing territories deeper in the Balkans and along the top of the Black Sea. And they're losing their grip on the farther reaches of North Africa, Morocco, and they're in retreat, and they have a discussion, and there is this period called reform, where the sultans try to claw back their position. And one of the ways they do it starting in the so-called Tanzimat period between 1839 and 1876. And in this period, they start to say, we will have citizens of the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't matter what ethnic group you belong to, or really from the Ottoman point of view, the traditional explanation was religious. Are you an Orthodox Christian? Because we're talking about Eastern Europe. Or are you a Muslim? Or are you a Jew? These are the three key groups. Nobody else. And each group has had almost complete autonomy for hundreds of years. They've been conquered, but actually when the Ottoman Empire was working well, when they were conquered, they got a pretty good deal from the sultans. Almost invariably, for example, for Christians, they ended up paying less tax. They had firmer rule of law, right? But there are unwritten rules here. So we've got religiously defined groups. And so these people are saying, no, I think we really do believe in citizenship and rights. But this is a problem for very pious Islamic people at this time because they never paid tax and they always had the top position. If you had a church, it couldn't be higher than the minaret of the mosque. In the 19th century, after a series of defeats, and particularly you've got to imagine that the reforms come after the Greek Revolution, which has been a bloodbath. So in the 1820s and in the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which is also Ottoman territory, he's landed fleets, the British have landed fleets. This is the kind of heritage for the reformers in the 19th century. And we're coming to the Young Turks. And the Young Turks at the end of the 19th century are trying to create a new constitutional society.
You just mentioned the word constitution.
Yes.
So I assume, was it an absolute monarchy until that period?
Yes.
And when did this constitution come about?
So the constitution comes about with the Tanzimat between 1839 and 1876. They experiment with the creation of what we would call like a consultative parliament, and they create the idea we're all citizens. You are a Muslim and I'm a Orthodox Christian, and you're a Jew. We can all be part of the Ottoman Empire. We can even elect people who will be in a consultative assembly. Now, this is something which is going to be very difficult in a lot of European societies in the 19th century. Yeah. The Turks are actually doing pretty well. For example, in Russia, they can't even begin to discuss this. They discuss it, but it can't be implemented until 1905. But what we have with the Young Turks, the putsch, that cast that we're talking about today, starts to happen 1908 for the second time. It's already been there in the middle of the 19th century. Consultative parliament, how far it's going to govern the Sultan, that's an open question.
We have Young Turks, and I assume they're called Young Turks because they were actually young?
Yes.
Or were their thoughts
So I
young?
think here we're getting a characteristically modern phenomenon. With the Young Turks, you've got a bunch of basically Balkan origin, some from Circassia, that is the part of what we now think of as the Stavropol region in Russia, and then going up into the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia. These areas, Chechnya, exactly. These are areas where there's been sustained pressure from the north, from Balkans, from Serbia, and northern Greece, Bulgaria. These are people who've had to flee, and they have a big chip on their shoulder, as you would expect. They're frightened. They've had a childhood that was traumatized, and then they go into the army. This is a classic pattern for the Young Turks. Enver Pasha, Jamal Pasha, they're all got this origin, and they want to modernize using military power. They're very highly educated, but they're educated in a way that's receptive to some kinds of European norms, parliament, military efficiency. They think that the old ways of doing things, the kind of exquisite Ottoman old ways of doing things, like smell the tulip, here is a cup of coffee, recite me some poetry,
Is that what they did during
let's
warfare?
sit in a kiosk and have, poetry.
Is kiosk, is that
Yes.
a Turkish word?
That's a Turkish
Kiosk,
word, kiosk.
Oh, fantastic. I never knew that. I've
Yeah,
been to
so
many kiosks
because
in
the
my
good
life.
life, we think a lot about the things in the good life: sherbet, coffee, kiosk, garden, bahçe. These are all Turkish concepts, because people from Europe who went there and saw this said, God, these guys can really live.
And I've got to ask, I'll give you my interpretation, then I'll ask you as a Turkish native speaker, and then hopefully we find out what it means. Being of German background, the word Pasha is used these days in a derogative term for especially young men from the Maghreb or of the Orient, as we call it, who boss their women around. It's sort of another word for macho. Also someone, who bosses their mum around and sits on the couch and doesn't do much. Is that what Pasha means?
No, not at all.
What does Pasha mean?
In Turkey, it's still used when you are referring to a high-ranking general.
Yes.
Pasha.
Okay.
So this comes from the Ottoman era. Very high-ranking, military men. So Kenan Evren, Pasha, we talked about 1980 coup, and even today, like the most high-ranking generals that run the military or the air force and navy, will be referred to as the Pasha or Pashas, obviously in
very different meaning.
Pashalar, historically and today.
I didn't know it meant general, so I've learned a lot too. Is the word Pasha used in English at all?
It was used in English because that's what, if you were dealing with the top Ottoman officials, they were all Pashas. So you called them Pasha. Yeah.
So every time we hear in this podcast the word Pasha, we're referring to a general. That's what it means?
Pretty well, except it could be a general who now has a very senior, what we would call public service role as Grand Vizier or
yes,
that's correct. Yeah,
or foreign minister or whatever.
So we've learned the Young Turks, intellectual, military men who want whatever suits them from Europe, but want to hold on to the old ways, redefine the Ottoman way, set it up for the 20th century.
So now we've got a discussion, though, about the Ottoman Empire is retreating, particularly in Europe, in Balkan Europe.
This is the era when it's called the sick man of Europe.
Yes, so which was what most people know the expression.
Yeah, so obviously that is a very derogatory term when we look at it in this context, but back then, obviously, it does signify that the Ottoman Empire is not well.
Yeah.
It's crumbling. It's under siege internally and externally. And then you have these new class of bureaucratic military men, obviously not women at that stage, looking for ways to save the empire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And you've got to think the sick man, it's actually the Russian Tsar's remark. Nicholas I. He goes to meet Count von Bentinck in somewhere, Münchengratz or somewhere and he remarks that the Ottoman Empire is a sick man. And this is after he's negotiated the remark dates from 1833, and it's after he's projected military power deep into what we would call Turkish Thrace, in and around Edirne, and he's dictated a treaty to the Ottoman Sultan, Mahmud II, at the height of the Greek crisis. He's dictated a treaty which says that Russia will now control the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. If we want to sail through there, we don't need to ask for permission. And what this does in 1833, and he says, they're just a sick man. And this is a product of since 1774, the Russians could intervene in any Balkan Christian place and say, you're harming Christians and I'm going to protect them. So you can imagine doing that in any foreign power, doing that in your own territory. This is what the Young Turks are really aggravated about. Then the Turkish state is bankrupt in 1876. And so the great powers go in again and say, we will manage your economy and we will take the top most lucrative businesses. And what would they be in Turkey? Tobacco, alcohol, and they take them over. So basically the powers are projecting their power over. They can send their agents anywhere. So there is a nationalist kind of response to
reaction, definitely, by these young military men.
And let's talk economy quickly, because it's usually at the heart of every crisis, as we know. Europe has undergone dramatic change during that period. Italy united, Germany united in the early 1870s, the economy going gangbusters, really, in particular industrialization. Everyone's trying to catch up with the UK. What state was Turkey in? You just mentioned alcohol and tobacco.
Well, alcohol is an illegal business, but it's, if you're a good pious Muslim, you're not supposed to drink. But certainly everyone in the Balkans has seen what's happened in Italy and in Greece and is thinking, if I'm an Orthodox Christian person in Bulgaria or in Serbia, or I'm going to try and achieve this. And in the Serbs and the Greeks basically achieve it in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, and they have a kind of, the Greece that exists independently is a tiny Greece, the Peloponnesus and not much else.
Yeah.
But then they will want to get more. And so the Turkish nationalists are seeing this, and the leaders have had to flee in some places. Like, remember, Enver Pasha is from Thessaloniki. Mustafa Kemal is from Thessaloniki. And so here are the two of the five greatest leaders, Jamal Pasha his mother is a Circassian. He grew up in Mytilene, in exile, the island off the coast.
Mytilene, yeah.
And the third one, Talat, is a similar case. They foment their nationalist movement in the 1870s and 80s, in the 1880s in particular, from Thessaloniki. And there you've got an amazing city which is 50% Jewish and like 20% Turkish maybe and 30% Greek. It's not even a Greek. Now it's a Greek town. So when you go there now, you think it's a Greek town.
I think that's crucial for our listeners to understand that most ethnic groups are still around. Others have almost perished, like Assyrians and other minorities that were a lot more predominant back in those days, but that the borders were in what we're talking about now, right? So that
yes.
When we talk Greece, it looked very different, and there were many Greek people living in Asia Minor compared to now, which is a different chapter in history. And the state was broke. Was there any attempt to industrialize the country before the Young Turks, or is that one of their main goals?
Well, they do need to have some industrial development, particularly to equip their armies and to metallurgy. So, yes, there are attempts.
Okay.
And there are the typical problems that go with that. But no, in general, when you look at the Ottoman Empire, you've got an underdeveloped economy. From the old Ottoman point of view, they were happy to let Jews, Armenians and Greek run their European economy.
Mm.
And they offered what they called capitulations for hundreds of years since the 16th century for British merchants, Dutch merchants, French merchants to run trade. So when we think in European terms of fine textiles like damask, that's an Ottoman product or a product from Bursa at the end of the Silk Road where all these gorgeous Eastern embroidered silks and kaftans and
Fabrics.
stuff come. And these are all traded to Genoese and Venetians and Italians and Greeks. And so the economy was never the top thing. The Ottoman thing was military power, effective government, serious Islam, cultural refinement. We're dealing with a society that is looking for its models more towards Persia than towards London. And so they don't send ambassadors until really the very beginning of the 18th century. So these are not the people who are going to be able to manage industrialization. Abdul Hamid, the Sultan after the...
So Abdul Hamid II?
Abdul Hamid II.
Yeah.
So he's a very interesting figure because we've talked about the reformers. Abdul Hamid is the anti-reformer, right? He's the child of the third wife of Abdul Majid. And he's not really supposed to inherit the throne, but he's got a very acute ears for the political winds, and he knows that the reform is deeply resented by pious Islamic people, particularly in Anatolia. And so he closes down the first constitutional in 1876. And so then we get a period of tight centralized autocratic rule again. So basically it lasts between 1839 and 1876, and the key figure is a wonderful, interesting guy, Midat Pasha, who's very interested in getting as much European ideas in. He still is a very pious Islamic person, but he understands the need to modernize.
Reform, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And he's the one who's talking about citizenship. Whereas if I'm a pious Muslim, I'm probably not very happy about the idea that a Greek has the same status as me.
After centuries of having those divisions in the millet system, now you can understand the mindset like, hang on a sec, everyone's going to be equal regardless of being a Jew or Orthodox Christian or Catholic. That obviously there was always going to be a reaction because you're going up against something that is so ingrained in Ottoman culture, especially if you're a Muslim, you always see yourself as top of the tree or a food chain, yes, in very crass terms. I mean, we've got to remember that we can't interpret that mindset from 2026 in our modern mindset. This was something that...
That's what I always try to do on this podcast.
You have to think about the Ottoman mindset in that era and then to be told that everyone's going to have the same rights. Of course, you are going to get a massive reaction because you are going to push people off and basically you threaten their position or their self-perceived position on top of the hierarchy.
Yeah. The constitution did work for about 30, 40 years, I've learned. And then Abdul Hamid II who came to the throne under suspicious circumstances. Also an odd-looking character. There's some photographs of him in his younger and older years.
Yeah, he's definitely not what you would think of as Ottoman Sultan, like Sultan Mehmet, Sultan Selim would have looked like. So he's not someone that you would imagine riding a horse into battle.
So please Google this character.
Abdul Hamid apparently was amazingly heavy drinker of coffee, and Turkish coffee is very strong, and he drank it with a lot of sugar. But according to the museum displays that I saw in the Yıldız Palace, because he built the Yıldız Palace just up from the Dolmabahce on the hill, he would drink about 30 cups of coffee, hot Turkish coffee a day. So you've got a pretty wired kind of guy. And he's definitely opposed to the reform era. And his decision to build the Yıldız Palace, which is a relatively modest palace in a big garden near the Baghdad Chud as you go up from the football ground. I'm trying to think of the football club.
Beşiktaş?
Beşiktaş,
yes.
Of course.
So it's in Beşiktaş, yes.
So you go, but then the reformers had strong support from the European powers, particularly France, Britain, and less support from Russia, even though, so after the Treaty of 1833, the British and the French basically say, we have to help the sick man get better, because if we don't, the Russians will dominate the whole of Eastern Europe. So that plays a new game.
Which then led obviously to the Crimean War.
Yes, and so then they all work well in the Crimea. The Turks perform pretty well in the Crimean struggle. And so they're all together. And then the sultans are building. If you go to Istanbul, when you go to Topkapı Palace, that's a very different palace from Dolmabahce,
on the
Beylerbeyi, these other huge European-style palaces. Not to my taste. I don't know how you feel about it as a Turk. When you go to the Dolmabahce Palace, it's like glitz and chintz.
It's very much so. It's extremely opulent in that you point out, very European style compared to Topkapı Palaces.
Whereas the Topkapı Palace, they've got no frame of reference to Europe at all. What their frame of reference is Persia, the best kinds of gardens in the Middle East, where you sit in a kiosk in a lovely tulip garden. What's not to like? We even use the word kiosk.
Yeah.
I will reach out to Turkish Airlines to sponsor this episode. By the way, it is a travel guide, but it's also a travel guide into history. So we've learned about the Young Turks. Abdul Hamid, odd character, the opposite of reformist. So he's arch-conservative, I would say. Can we say that about him?
Yes, and then towards the end, he will start to play politics with ethnic rivalries, which is something new.
The Crimean War went okay for the Ottomans. There was another short war against Russia that then led to the action of Abdul Hamid. Is that correct?
That's right, because Abdul Hamid comes to power in 1876. There's a previous Sultan, Mustafa V, who's there just for 90 days, I think. And he had deposed Abdulaziz, his uncle. Abdulaziz had travelled extensively in Western Europe. These three sultans, Abdul Majid, 1830s, Abdulaziz, 1840s to 60s, through to 60, and then Abdulaziz is deposed in 1876. Then this new sultan comes to power and he has mental health issues, and Abdul Hamid, the court elite, comes around him and says, this guy's capable. Whereas Mustafa V was chronically anxious and totally a creature of the kind of coffee room. And he was also very worried that Abdulaziz had been murdered after he had been deposed. So he thought he was going to be blamed for that, and he wasn't responsible, but he felt obviously he would be blamed because his uncle.
Yeah. Paranoia.
So he basically retreated into a kind of deep mental illness. He actually came out of it later, and Abdul Hamid, for all his cruelty, kept him shut away in one of the palaces, and he lived to be, Mustafa V lived to be until 1904.
So Abdul Hamid II, love him or loathe him, he was quite successful in what he was doing because he was around for quite a while. So he's still there at the start of the 20th century. He's obviously taken his country on a back road, I assume, for this whole time. And then in 1908, the Young Turks, are they still young after all those years? Anyway, the Young Turks, they just remain young, okay? They had enough. 1908, the first putsch occurs. What happened? Could you walk us through, please?
These Young Turks are basically more idealistic young military officers, and they are young. They're not the top commanders. They're not the Pashas. These are lieutenant colonels.
Middle
and this
ranking.
is a classic kind of 20th century formula, isn't it? You know, the colonels in Greece in 1974, you know, the Gaddafi in Libya.
I was going to say that same example.
So,
well, I mean, the 1960 coup in Turkey, the first coup of the Republic, was undertaken by middle-ranking officers.
Yes, and so if we put it in a Turkish from this period, these are some of the best educated people to be found in Turkey. They're better educated in European languages, in European norms. They're right up to date with the latest military technology because they understand that unless we do this, we'll be defeated by Russians and Greeks and Serbs. And so they're modernizers. And what they want to do in the first revolution is they want to insist that we bring back these liberal institutions. And they're actually, and the three key figures are Jamal, Talat, and Enver. And they each have their roles, but they're all basically got this refugee background. They're not from the old power elite of people who lived in and around Istanbul and Constantinople and manipulated the court. These are young modernizers, and they bring back the parliament, but at first they are happy to remove the old Grand Vizier and the old elite and put in people they think are sympathetic to their modernizing vision. So that's the first constitutional revolution in 1908. They bring back the Meclis, the parliament.
That's the Turkish prototype. Cool.
So they're basically pulling the strings from behind the scenes.
Yeah.
At this point. And it changes in a few years' time.
And if you walk down, their natural home is actually, if you've been to Istanbul and you walk down the Istiklal Chad and you go past all those glorious, basically Armenian and Greek built department stores, then you go there, and in there is the English club on the second floor, and that's where they often met. Or they'd meet on the Mesrutiet Chad near the Peripalis Hotel. And they would have coffee and wine, not very pious, you know, and they would sit and discuss. And so their norms are, if you like, Parisian modernizing Third Republic norms. And they're even prepared to say, you know, I can see that Armenians and Greeks have been oppressed, and in our new constitutional society, we will give them honor, try to protect them and give them rights. What they will never do is allow Greeks and Armenians to enter the army, but nor would the Ottoman elite, even the reformers.
You've talked about Abdul Hamid. He's been there for quite a while. He's clearly experienced, or was he weak at the time? Because a few junior officers don't just topple an ancient dynasty like that. What actually happened? Can you walk us through? Was he actually toppled 1908?
No, he's not. He's basically shown a new reality from the leaders of the military who are saying this is how it must be, and he has to swallow it. He doesn't like it, and so there will be an attempt at counter-revolution led from the palace and Abdul Hamid in 1909.
Yeah.
You know, once you've been shown absolute power, it's a very rare person who gives that up. I don't know whether you would. Yeah,
especially when you've got hundreds of years of history there as well, tradition.
Why should I? I'm the Sultan.
Exactly, and if you've had that power in your hands for a while, it's hard to say, okay, no worries, like this is going to change.
So within a year, basically, we have a coup, we have a counter coup.
In 1909.
Was that bloody? Was it at gunpoint? How did it happen?
Absolutely. We have to then, the Young Turks, the top three, have to then call in what they called an action army, Hareket Ordusu. They brought in people from what we would call Bulgaria, you know, And there was a formula for that because that happened in 1808 as well. If there's trouble, they bring in more of their kind of Balkan friends in the army and they put down the counter-revolution, depose Abdul Hamid and bring in the next Sultan, Mehmet V. And he's the guy who'll take us right through the First World War. And he is their man for the throne. So the Young Turks have played a bit hands-off, probably a bit politically inexperienced in a sense. Still a bit of that old Ottoman culture, I think, that they thought, we can't rule directly. We're only lieutenant colonel and,
A bit shy.
A little bit shy, yes.
Yeah.
So now in the second coup in 1909, they're again taking charge and putting in a new government, but they still don't run the government.
Which means Abdul Hamid's counter coup has de facto failed.
Yes, it's failed, and he's now out of power. He's been shunted away.
Did he lose his head?
That's a good question. I don't think
so.
I think he's held. I actually forgotten what happened to him. I knew what happened to Mustafa V, but
yeah, because I thought he might have had a similar fate.
He's deposed. This is a period where you don't kill people with imperial blood too lightly. But I actually forgotten how.
That's okay. Here on Pushcast, we're honest and we don't know everything either. But
yes.
We will provide the information as soon as it comes to hand.
Yes.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on two wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the fifth continent. Visit motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au to check out the fleet. Don't forget to mention Podcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Terms and conditions apply.
You're listening to Pushcast, your favorite revolutionary podcast on the airwaves. And in our studio is Professor Adrian Jones and Dr. Tezcan Gümüş. We have been talking about the late Ottoman Empire. We've learned many things, such as the tolerance that was often present, also the financial trouble the empire was in, and also we've learned about the first two coups. So I think it's the first Pushcast episode where we actually talk about three coups in one go, simply because they were so close to each other. So the 1908 coup, the Young Turks, which are young military officers trying to bring back reform, bring back a parliament, and simply modernize what was then still the Ottoman Empire. Abdul Hamid II, Sultan at the time, wasn't too happy. Counter coup on the 31st of March, the year after. However, he failed, and then the Young Turks definitely had enough. He was gone. God knows what happened to him. And then he was replaced by Mehmet V.
Yep.
And Mehmet V was then in power from 1909 until the end of the Ottoman Empire.
Not till the end, but nearly the end.
Okay. And
he nearly lived to the end of the First World War.
And then, even before the war, there was another coup.
Exactly.
How did it get to that?
So the Young Turks are getting more and more effective. So one of the things that they do is rig an election in 1912 and win a colossal majority. And so what we have intervening is the Balkan Wars. So again, now a whole new round. So we've had a series of kind of struggles in northern Greece in particular is the focal point. So in 1881, the Greek government manages to take what we would call Thessaly, that is the part down from Mount Olympus. And so Turks have to leave from these areas. And basically the typical pattern in these, what we think of Greece, is that there are Turkish communities mainly living in the towns, doing the trade and managing the courts and whatever. And then we also have a series of more trouble in Crete.
There was one
where
there
the Greeks
as well.
are saying, look at these Turks. They're modernising. We have to modernise because the Greek army had not performed well in 1897 against the Turks. So it's not just the Turks who are going through these pressures,
Yeah.
So there's a Greek military coup. They promote Venizelos, and Venizelos' idea is very simple. He says, look, we will never move the Ottoman Empire out of the Balkans unless we Bulgarians, Yugoslavs, Serbs, unite. And we've always hated each other because Greeks don't like Slavs, right? But he says, if we're going to break the power of the Ottoman Empire in Balkans, we need a united front.
Let's be pragmatic.
Yes. And that's exactly what they do in 1912.
But was the Kremlin involved by any chance, given
Pan-Slavism? Of course, the Russians are Pan-Slavist, and they are very strongly supporting this, well, not just the Greeks, but the re-Slavicization of the Balkans. So you have the Balkan Wars, and these are devastatingly successful. A united front. And in 1912, we suddenly have Greeks in Thessaloniki. We have them we have Bulgarians in Edirne. We have the loss of, what we would call now Northern Macedonia. So the Ottomans only have help from Albania, which is half Muslim. And so it's a massive crisis. And the Young Turks, the governments that were handling this war were losing. And this prompts the three top Young Turks to take charge.
Was this Jamal, Tamad, and Enver?
Yeah, Enver. And so they're the ones for now. So from 1912, 1913, we now have the Young Turks not just in the government, now they're running the government. And we have what we call the triumvirate.
Yes.
So they emancipated themselves finally, which they should have or could have done 4 or 5 years before that.
Yes, and they're so worried. These are worried guys because remember, they're refugees from this region in their own families. And they have got a huge chip on their shoulder. They're going to exact revenge. The question is, what kind of revenge? So what they want is to rebuild the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans.
Yeah.
And they're going to try and rebuild it in Tripoli in Libya as well, 1911. And so they are taking charge, and they're doing it with authoritarian action.
So you just mentioned in 1911 they were also fighting the Italians who were building up their own empire in what is now Libya.
Yeah, because the Italians are saying, I can pick out this bit.
Yeah, which, again, sick man of Europe. And I have to ask one question, though. So we've had the Young Turks, military background, smart men, saloon militarists, basically, had all the great ideas and vision. How come they failed so miserably in 1912? How come that countries that didn't even have standing armies, such as Bulgaria and Macedonia, whoever was, uprising, local peasants with, very basic arms, revolting against the Ottoman rule? How come those young generals, Pashas, which they would have been at that stage, I assume, how come there was no resistance? And that
was exactly the question they were asking. Remember, they're not in the top positions in the government.
Not yet.
They have deposed one Sultan, Abdullah Mehmed, and brought in Mehmed V. But they're not running everything, except they maybe increasingly think they should.
Yeah.
And so they are very angry at the Minister of War. And so one of their number assassinates the Minister of War at the gate of the Sublime Porte, the head of the government. So in 1912, one of the Young Turk zealots, and it's unclear, murders the Minister of War because he's failed so badly in his eyes. We've got a situation where Thessaloniki is fallen to the Greeks in 1912. The Bulgarians aren't happy about that because they thought they should have Thessaloniki. The Bulgarians are feeling they haven't got much. In March of 1913, you have the fall of Edirne, probably my favourite town in Turkey. It's the town right in the tip of European Turkey with the border with Greece and the border with Bulgaria. And it's got some of the most gorgeous Ottoman architecture. And so this city falls in March of 1913 to a Bulgarian army. And then Enver Pasha, because the Greeks and the Bulgarians and the Serbs fell out, the Bulgarian army has to leave. And Enver Pasha comes back in July to Edirne. That's why that place is still a Turkish place. It's not a Bulgarian place, even though the Bulgarian border is only 10 kilometres away and the Greek border is only 10 kilometres the other way. So Enver Pasha gets enormous kudos. The old elites are blamed for the defeat, but Enver got us back Edirne and all those archetypal Ottoman values. And then Enver then makes a decision that the only way we can beat and regain our control of our birthright in the Balkans is for an alliance with Germany.
Even though the Austro-Hungarian Empire just grabbed Bosnia on the way.
Exactly. So you've got then the seizure of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, which was a very, well, how would you say it, naughty act in terms of international law.
Yeah.
And then when you need one, because we all know that the First World War started when an Austrian crown prince was murdered in the streets of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that's because for the Austrian crown prince to visit Sarajevo was a very provocative act for every Slavonic-speaking person in the Balkans. And Gavrilo Princip shot him dead. And then that causes the First World War. Of course, we always ask, why did the rest of Europe care?
Because the chauffeur didn't know what he was doing, but also the Turks have lost Bosnia to begin with. If they wouldn't have lost it, World War I would have never happened. So this is stuff you find out on Puchcast.
Great history lessons for me. I mean, my focus has always been on the Republican and so modern Turkey. So Ottoman era is a bit more has always been less of a focus research area. So hence why I'm loving listening to Adrian talk.
There is a script book though which they're all following. Kenan Evren, the coup leaders in 1960. That I, as a military officer, very well educated and know best for you.
Well, these are things that I think towards the end wanted to pose was the continuities of this era with the modern republic. But I think I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, because I think the especially if people have listened to our episode that we've done previously about the 1980 coup, the parallels are already there.
Puchcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
So we have those three Pashas in power. You've used the word triumvirate.
Yes.
Now, I've heard about that before in history. One was Caesar, the other one was Napoleon, and none of them ended well.
Yes, exactly. I think, it's probably the word they used wouldn't have been triumvirate. That's a Latin word, but like Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus.
So, Adrian, you're saying there's no positive example in history where a triumvirate actually worked out. What happened in this case, and how powerful were they actually?
Well, they're definitely not opposed to the idea of the Sultanate. They're not Republicans. They're not French revolutionaries. They're modernising military officers who've changed the man at the top. The man at the top is meant to follow their advice like a constitutional monarch, but it's not announced in that way. And also you've got to remember to make the Kaiser alliances with Vienna, Kaiser there, Kaiser in Berlin, So you need... the three Kaisers are important. So they need Mehmet V to operate in that way. We know that the German Kaiser is definitely in charge. He's made the key foreign policy decisions. But in Vienna, maybe not.
They enjoy a good life too much.
Franz Joseph is a very old man and he's there at the start, and he's obviously a key figure, but there are people around him in each of those places. Now, in the Young Turks start to make decisions to go closer to Germany. They bring in, after the defeat in the Balkan Wars, German military specialists, von Moltke.
I think it's really important to say that Enver Pasha is head of the military now. So out of the three, they divide the powers.
Yeah.
And Enver is in charge of the entire military of the Ottoman Empire.
Let's talk about him a bit more because he is the central figure here. And I have to be honest, I knew his name. That's about it. In my research for today, there's not much on him. Yes, in literature there is, but in English is not much on him when it comes to documentaries or films compared to other leaders of the time. In Turkish, there seems to be abundance of material on this man. And there's still a song that's flooding the internet everywhere, or it's a march, better to say, that I've come across. And just to break it up a bit, let's just listen to this. And maybe afterwards, if you could tell us, Tez, as our interpreter of the day here, what the song roughly was about. So let's just have a listen to this song. I'm not sure when it's from, but maybe some of our listeners know.
paşa. Bir emir ver orduna, Kafkas dağını aşa. Hoş gelişler ola, kahraman Enver Paşa. Askeri milletin bayrağına çok yaşa. Arş arş arş, ileri ileri, arş ileri, marş ileri. Dönmez biri, Türk'ün askeri. Sağdan sola, soldan sağa, al da bayrağı düşman üstüne. Cephede mitralyöz ayna gibi parlıyor. Türkistan Türkleri bayrak açmış bekliyor. Cephede mitralyöz ayna gibi parlıyor. Türkistan Türkleri bayrak açmış bekliyor. Arş arş arş, ileri ileri, arş ileri, marş ileri. Dönmez biri, Türk'ün askeri.
Yeah, I think we get the idea. So it's definitely a marching song. It does sound like early 20th century march, march, march. I think even I understood that.
Yes, yeah, that's very good.
And it's called Enver Pasha March. Have you ever heard the song before?
Immediately the melody and the chorus came back to me and I started hymning to it. And it's been, I can say it's been probably decades since I've heard
But
it.
it is a song people know.
Yeah, definitely. So you are right. It's something, the music is akin to the Ottoman marching band. So, the trumpets and those sort of wind instruments and the drums. The lyrics are about glorifying Enver Pasha's military prowess, taking land in the Caucasus and things like that, but also glorifying the great Turkish soldier, military. That, and it's urging, so say, march, march, march forward, the Turkish soldier, Turkish military. So it's a very, very patriotic song. It's there to like get the heart pumping and really just those patriotic, emotions overflowing.
And it might not be even from the period. The song might be from after where maybe he was glorified. I'm not sure.
That's a very good question,
I think it possibly is from the period. It's certainly a traditional
Ottoman
branch. Because you needed the meta band, because if you're in battle, in the tumult, you needed the drums to tell you what to do. That's what you did.
But I think what this song beautifully reflects is that German influence as well. It's that very Prussian sort of marching style mixed with Ottoman influences, which is what the triumvirate and Enver Pasha, back to the topic, was all about, right?
Well, the meta band is very old. It dates from the 15th century. So, and they were the first military force to use music to choreograph the battle.
Yeah, so I think they're the first military band.
So, like in the Scottish Highlands, the same, the pipers. And, of course, you have pipers in that band.
Yeah.
But what I hear is the Kafkas. He's talking about the Kafkas. And that's... So
it's a great segue.
And he mentioned Turkestan. And this is the difference between Mustafa Kemal's generation after the war and the wartime generation. Enver Pasha died in Turkestan after the war in Bukhara, in Tajikistan, trying to create a federal Turkic republic, because they speak a Turkic language in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in Turkmenistan. And Enver is saying, so the reason he wanted, the first thing he did in the First World War when they started is that he shelled Odessa from using German battleships that they'd given him. So that meant he poked the eye of the Russian bear.
Yeah.
Where you go to Odessa and you pulverize their port. And then, of course, there's war.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second thing he did was to march an army to what we would call High Armenia in the Caucasus. And they fought this colossal battle in the mountaintops at Sarikamish. January 1914, and this is the song he's saying, go to Kafkas, go to Caucasus.
Urging,
What Enver was saying is that if with the alliance with the great German powers, German-speaking powers, we can build the Ottoman Empire again, and the Kaiser Wilhelm is telling him, yes, you can, because he doesn't have that much interest in that part of the world. And so there we have the dream. It's a kind of Turkestan dream, but he would also like to do the same in Bulgaria, in northern Macedonia.
The word Turkestan being used like the Russians have the Pan-Slavism, he now introduces a Turkish version of that, which is basically what it is, right? It's a form of imperialism to unite all the Turkish people and spread the borders as far as we can. My question regarding that one is that the moment where Ottoman was buried and Turkey was elevated? Is that sort of...
we're now we're in a modern world with nationalism important.
Yeah.
The Balkan War, they're dealing with somebody else's nationalism, Greek, Serb.
Then also you got in the south, the Arab populations too.
We haven't touched on that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, World War I, you have, the British do a fantastic job with, obviously, everyone knows Lawrence of Arabia in galvanizing the Ottoman Arab population to revolt against the Ottomans. But then you've also got, I guess, we have to understand, Enver Pasha is also highly criticized for his adventurism.
Yes.
And for aligning the Ottoman state with the Germans and entering World War I is a highly, highly criticized move by him.
Let's take it a step back. Let's understand who this man was. So there's 3 people in the triumvirate. We don't have time for all of them, but Enver Pasha, he has a song dedicated to him. Let's dedicate him a few minutes. Do we know anything about his biography, who he was? In my research, I found that he was always interested in anything German, Prussian earlier, and then became German. He spoke German fluently, apparently. That really helped with the negotiations. And then also the name Ludendorff popped up again. And you mentioned Moltke before. And if you listen to a previous podcast episode where we talked about the fall of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Ludendorff had a very crucial role to play, never owned up to anything, blamed it on everyone else. Mm. And this seems to be a very, very similar scenario here. So, but what do we know about this man? You told us about his ethnic background. What do we know about his personality, Enver Pasha?
Well, he's an arrogant fellow, full of belief in his own destiny, which he saw kind of played out because they had lost Edirne and he had taken it back. He's the one leader who's had some success in his case, July 1913, and now he's going to extend power into the Caucasus and humiliate the Russian army. He has a colossal defeat. He's an interesting guy. He's from Northern Macedonia, from Monastir, Bitola in Slavonic, southern Northern Macedonia, which is now thoroughly Slavonicized, but it was Greek Ottoman sort of place, has some very rather nice mosques. But he's full of self-belief. He's come through a period where he's still given power to the Ottoman elites, trading different sets of them, and now he's calling the shots. And his shots are to basically try to rebuild as much of the Ottoman Empire in partnership with the other empires, the Austro-Hungarian. So he's a realist. He's not going to get Bosnia back, but he's a risk taker. These are colossal risk takers. And Mustafa Kemal is always saying, and he can say something, this is too big a risk. And the vision of a pan-Turkic state, which is one nation-state option, but if you ask a Kazakh, they're not interested in that. Enver's not going to do that. He'll die in Bukhara in 1920.
In exile.
Yeah.
Fighting for what he believed in.
Yes.
I think the irony is that when we talk about the Young Turk period, obviously people do ask about what about Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He was a mid-ranking officer at that stage, and he was extremely critical of Enver. Enver, same thing. So Enver actually did not want him in the elite circles of the Young Turk movement.
So he was important enough for Enver to know him at the time.
Yes, but the irony is, even though, and like Adrian has said, Atatürk, I will call him Atatürk, I guess Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was critical of his adventurism, his wish to, him basically starting a front with the Russian Empire. And so he thought he was an unrealistic commander. But the irony is, Enver is the man that put Mustafa Kemal in charge of the Gallipoli campaign,
Indeed.
Which ended up being pretty much the only victory in World War I for the Ottomans, which made him into a national hero.
Yeah.
So even though the two men didn't like each other, it was Enver's decision to place Mustafa Kemal at the charge of the defense of Gallipoli, which obviously the Australian audiences, the British, New Zealand audiences listening to this would know. how important that campaign was.
Yeah, and even Winston Churchill had a connection which makes us global again.
Yes.
Who doesn't know Winston Churchill? We haven't really talked about the 1913 coup. That still bothers me a bit.
When we think of the 1913 coup, it is what we would think of a coup to be. It was them taking direct control of I guess, administration of the Ottoman Empire, taking control of it.
Their first key decisions are foreign policy decisions, and they're wanting to reverse the recent losses in the Balkan Wars and whatever. And what do? They make crucial decisions which enable the success in Gallipoli. They bring in German military advisors to help them strengthen the Dardanelles forts, because they know that's obviously a pressure point. They renew the defensive infrastructure, which is already pretty impressive. Of course, they need that because they're going to have a colossal Allied fleet come to them in February, March of 1915 to try and storm the Dardanelles, and they can't get anywhere.
Yeah.
So there are whole reasons for that, but basically they had this colossal fleet, but they needed to have better battleships than the ones they had to storm it. They already moved towards a German alliance by using the German advisors, and then they make the fatal decision in August secretly to back the Germans.
Plus there's the famous railway to Baghdad, I think.
Well, that's right. The Germans have already been funding the extension to Baghdad. Yes.
Is it okay for me to call it a military dictatorship at this stage, which is what we ended up in Germany during World War I as well?
Well, I think that was pretty well the pattern throughout the First World War, that you had to wage total war, which probably the Ottoman side didn't understand as much as some of the others. For example, they never used their Greek population or mobilised them. They never used the Armenian population. In fact, they did the opposite.
So it was mainly Turkish, ethnic Turks fighting in the army?
Yes, because you if you're a Greek or an Armenian, you could be pressed into what was called an amur tabulele, a labour battalion. And your job was not to bear arms, but to bring...
Sorry, Adrian. Just on that point, I think we have to understand that it's given the growing nationalism within their borders, the Balkans, the separation, these men start to have extreme paranoia of the other within the Ottoman Empire, so the other ethnic or religious groups. So they start to look at them with distrust as colluders with outside empires that will work with the outside empires like the Russias or the British and so forth and the French.
As the Greeks have done before, right, in the 19th century.
So these men grew to be extremely distrustful due to their experiences with the Balkan Wars and also the growing nationalism within their borders, obviously expressed by the minority groups within the Ottoman Empire. So they really start to look at them with distrust, and that's where we look at what happened, I guess, the Armenian population and things like that.
So this then obviously was a disadvantage for them, but I did hear that there was about 600,000 Arabs though fighting in the Ottoman army.
Yes, and this was a problem. I mean, we know that, for example, Mustafa Kemal, about whom I'm writing at the moment, he was worried about whether in 1915 the Arab troops he had there, and because when you go to the cemetery there, and it was erected in 2007, very late on the Turkish side, you can see the names of lots of Arab names from Syrian provinces and whatever. He was worried whether they would fight, but they did. They fight quite strongly, had nothing to worry about. But when we have the Arab revolt in Arabia itself, and we're moving into 1916, 1917, then we have a problem.
And I think, this is me guessing, the reason why they did that is because it was also about religion. And obviously
the caliphate.
The caliphate.
Yes.
And also looking at what the English and the French have done over the last 50 years or so, build a global colonial empire based on Christian values with conversions around the world. They obviously said, better the devil you know, and I'd rather fight with the Turks, but at least they're fellow Muslims, rather than aligning with the French or the English.
Well, the Germans, when they entered, they thought the advantage of having the Ottomans on their side is that the Ottomans could create some sort of propaganda with the Muslim soldiers fighting for the British, so the Indian Muslim soldiers, that they would be able to somehow use Ottomans being Muslims to try and uprise against the British internally. The sort of Muslim battalions, so Indian Muslim battalions fighting for the British, would somehow change sides and sort of fight against the British. So the Germans actually thought this was a real tactic that they could use the Ottomans for. The appeal of the Muslims sort of fighting against.
Split the colonial powers of the British. Now, the triumvirate, do they last throughout the war?
Yes, they each have their different spheres. Talat is managing foreign policy, the government. He's the principal architect of mass repression of the Armenians in particular. So that's Talat's role. Enver is making the key military decisions, liaising with the high command. They all do this. Jamal is mostly in the southeastern provinces, so he spends most of the war in Syria, in what we would call Lebanon, Palestine. He's trying to stiffen the main battlefront for them in 1916-17, and then he has to then confront some very effective British generals in what we would call Palestine.
Yes.
Yeah. In 1916, 1917. But it takes some doing. They lose, like a whole British army is lost at Kut al-Amara near Baghdad in 1916. They lose. They're captured. We don't often hear that.
Yeah.
They fight at Gallipoli on land because the naval attack failed. They don't get any further than the top ridge. So that's a huge setback. Then they try again at Thessaloniki, landing another army, mainly French. In 1916, 17, 18, they're fighting in what we would call Greek Thrace, Northern Macedonia, and the Bulgaria. They can't really shift that either. So their first breakthrough comes in Palestine in 1917, and it's Jamal who's trying to manage that. He has some responsibility for what happens to Armenians, yes, but he's not the zealot that Talat Pasha was. That's why I always have mixed feelings about when I cross the bridge going into Edirne. There's a Talat Pasha bridge, and I think, should they name it after him?
We'll have that discussion in a minute. Usually, in times of war, if you're doing well, you don't have to worry, you're being supported. Given that the three men we're talking about are de facto putschists, who are not there by any democratic means, when things started going pear-shaped for the Ottoman Empire under their leadership, was there any resistance, any neoconservative movement that now blamed them for the outcomes of the war? Because after all, you mentioned that Enver was basically responsible for dragging the Ottoman Empire into this war. Was there any attempts of overthrowing them, especially in the dying days? This is what usually happens in empires.
No. What happens is that, there's an armistice signed on the 30th of October. So we think the First World War ended on the 11th of the 11th, 1918. But for the Ottomans, for Bulgarians, it ended on the 30th of September. And then the Ottomans, the top three are still in charge. They make the decision to sign the armistice. They have some debates about it in the last weeks, but they're all pretty realistic about that we can't win this war. We're defeated. Total surrender. They lose control of the Dardanelles. Within a month, there are 35 battleships anchored off the city of Constantinople.
So, if any listeners are interested, if they should actually look at how the Ottoman lands were divided up. So you've got Italy's got a sphere of influence, the Greeks, which is the West Coast, the French, the Kurdish people have their own territory, the Armenians. So the only place that was neutral was Istanbul. And the reason for that was that the Russians really wanted that, pushing Istanbul because they'd have control of the Bosphorus. And Churchill, obviously being the wily fox he was, he said he knew exactly what would happen. It was that, no, we're going to have this as international sort of protectorate.
And they can do that because the Russian Revolution has happened.
Exactly.
And they're out of the picture.
Yeah.
So in 1918, so they've had negotiations. I always think of the Anzac soldiers on Gallipoli, the Allied. They had no idea what had been decided between Britain and France, the so-called Sykes-Picot Pact, where they had just quietly negotiated in London and Paris and and with the Italians later, they were cynical enough to offer the same pieces of Anatolia to the Greeks and to the Italians.
They did the same with the Arabs, right? And
Yes.
I've learned in my Russian studies that Trotsky was actually the one who leaked that information.
Yes.
The Russians had to sign off on it. So there's another anecdote of history.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.
We're coming close to the end here today, talking about the 3 coups in the late Ottoman Empire that, I think we can say that now, resulted in World War I, because who knows what would have happened if it weren't for them, if it was a different man in charge of the empire at this stage. But we also learned that the 3 survived.
Well, they run
the
away so the armistice is signed on the 30th of October. They choose to run away on the 9th, the night of the 1st of November and the 2nd. And they get into a German sort of speedboat, and the Germans speed them across to the Crimea. And there they sort of eventually end up in Berlin. 2 of them are assassinated by Armenian revolutionaries later on, 1922, and 1 dies in Bukhara. But so they're spent. And this is a problem because there wasn't much internal opposition. You've got to imagine the parliament's not functioning, but there is very clear second-level leaders of the movement, the Young Turk movement. The top 3 have run away. That's very clarifying, don't you think?
Yeah.
And so they are starting to sound out other possibilities. They have an Anglo-French-Italian occupation, but there is an undercurrent of revolutionary agitation, and they have to manage that. And in that process, Mustafa Kemal is starting to appear as the person.
The Young Turk movement do sound him out to take the leadership post these 3 leaders,
Yes.
but he doesn't want anything to do with it.
Okay. So was the Young Turk brand pretty damaged by this stage?
Yes, it was toxic.
So a complete damaged political brand, I understand that they've had 40 years of
it's not
getting
so
things
damaged
right.
in the sense that there's no other elite that's running the show.
Yeah.
So what they do is evolve towards a new movement. That's to be sure, but that'll take place in 1919. If we look at the political elite, leave out the top 3 who've run away and are dead, all of them, by 1920, 22, 24, right?
Yeah.
They're all dead. Then the political elite that run Republican Turkey with Mustafa Kemal are all basically still there. The occupation puts some of them on trial, but abandons the trial. They take a more realistic position, not to revive the Ottoman Empire, but to build a Turkish national state.
Realistically obtainable. Not
yes, because they've got
borders.
enough trouble doing that because they have a French occupation, Italian occupation,
Greek occupation, British occupation.
The Greeks
Russian.
have been fanned to go there by the British. The French basically give up after a while. So that's the decision. They're going more Turkish, but a narrower definition of it.
It starts off with being a very highly liberal idea of what Turkish or Ottomanism is. And then through their experiences, it becomes more and more and more and more narrow and narrow and exclusive, which ends up being Turkish. The founders of the Republic actually determine, there's actually massive debates about what defines Turkishness, what is it? So it ends up being pretty much being of Muslim faith, Sunni Muslim faith, and they sort of decide on who falls into that category.
And this is all the result of the end of the Ottoman Empire after centuries and centuries of consistent rule, tolerance, pragmatism.
Yeah.
That's right.
I love the James Bond story, by the way, with the speedboat across the Black Sea in the middle of the night. Like the Germans had nothing else to do in 1918. There was assassinations. One died for what he believed in.
Two were assassinated in Berlin.
And I still can't believe that we don't know more about that in the Western English-speaking world. Tez, before today, I did ask you to snoop around a bit and maybe speak to people or do some research on this period and how it's viewed today in Turkey. I'd love to find out, is there any sense of nostalgia for this late Ottoman period? Because in the Western world, it's still this mysterious, place
I don't believe this particular last few decades there's any sort of nostalgia or wish to return back to. But there is a massive nostalgia and romanticism about the Ottoman Empire and its so-called glory, rereading of its history, which fails to mention the last couple hundred years where it was a pretty decaying empire. That's sort of missed in this nostalgia. And I think a lot of this has to do with, as Adrian and I were talking about before we started recording, the AKP era really ushered in this glorification of Ottoman era.
Which is the current ruling party
Yes,
in Turkey.
yeah, under President Erdogan. But prior to the AKP, it was very much, throughout the Republican history, it was very much taught as very backwards, very decrepit. It's only captured the imagination of a lot of the public in Turkey, or the nostalgia, the positive nostalgia in the AKP area, and that has a lot to do with the series, the dramatization of this era. You can watch it on Netflix. There's a couple of really popular Ottoman era series like Ertuğrul about and so it's sparked this. I don't know. I guess it's probably false nostalgia, because as any dramatization of history is not based on reality, it's based on very wishy-washy rose-tinted glasses. But in terms of that era, no, it's obviously if you talk to people of a very nationalist or right-wing ideology, they'll probably look at Enver Pasha as some sort of hero, strong man. But if you talk to people of more of a Republican or secular or Kemalist background, they'll view it with complete criticism of these three men. So it also depends on who you talk to. But definitely, if you think about if you're asking about Ottoman era, there's definitely a strong nostalgia, this belief how glory the Turkish nation lived throughout the history of Ottoman era. So it's very handpicked, sort of selective.
But then in the
memory.
Previous bit between 1919 and 1938, when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died, 1938, there's a lot of hostility towards Ottomanism. There's language reform. We turn our back on all that. We need to westernise. There's certainly deep criticism of the triumvirs. Their bodies are only brought back to Turkey in 1943, 5 years in the middle of the Second World War, as a kind of statement, but they're not in a particularly prominent spot. They're in high on the hill above Shishli. There's a huge freeway that goes across between the crossing point of the Golden Horn right across to the Rumeli, the first bridge, the Bosporus Bridge. And it's, there's a monument there. It's a monument to freedom, Abide Hurriyet, but it's not a pivotal place. I think Inanu in the Second World War felt that they should do something for them, but he certainly couldn't do it when Mustafa Kemal was alive. So you have that. It's not, but there are monuments. There are a lot of Talat Pasha streets and squares and, and Jamal, particularly Enver. Yes, so there are monuments and streets and things, yes.
I have to bring it up, obviously, but because of the genocide, as it's called in many countries, they are therefore war criminals abroad. They're viewed as war criminals.
Yes,
that's correct.
But they're still celebrated in Turkey these days.
It's not. I don't think they're celebrated. I think there's certain kinds of people who would admire them.
Yes.
I do think they were war criminals, yes. But we have to understand the context in the sense that they were very fearful. They were refugees themselves. They responded with the utmost violence. They killed the men outright and sent the families, the old, the women, the children, to a kind of slow death in a difficult way.
March. Yeah.
So that was a terrible war crime. They were facing what they saw as subversion. I think there are some resemblances to what's happened in contemporary crisis in the sense that the leaders of the Armenian movement were calling for a rebellion from a safe, nice, tidy house in the equivalent of Qatar, right? In Armenia itself, Russian-dominated Armenia or somewhere like it. And they were calling for a revolution in the face of a regime that they know were their dreadful enemies and who were ready to kill if. So when you do that with your people, I think the first idea of a leader of the revolutionary Armenian movement was to look after their people. and they delivered them into the jaws of hell. And that's the reality. Now, whether they're still war criminal, these three are war criminals, definitely. But a lot of people were involved. You can understand why that generation of military officers, refugees from the Balkans, would respond in that way.
Turkey did stay out of the Second World War. Do you think these were lessons learned from World War I?
Yeah, I mean, İsmet İnönü, who was the president after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who was also essentially his right-hand man, the second in charge throughout Atatürk's life and leadership of the country. Yeah, consciously kept Turkey out of World War II.
Yeah, so Churchill flies to Ankara, I think after the war meeting in Casablanca, where they decide that they will have to fight to surrender, complete total surrender, which probably prolonged the Second World War a little, because that's what the Russians were demanding. Churchill flies there and tries to get Inanu in the battle. And Hitler, of course, was quite capable of invading anybody's country, really. And he chose not to, he's in the Aegean Islands, in the Italian islands, they're just stone's throw. So the Germans decided not to attack. So they also learned something too. Hitler learned something. But Hitler is also quoted as remarking that no one has ever talked about the Armenian Genocide.
I think we'll leave it at that. Final question for me. Are there any Turkey-related coups we should still talk about on Pushcast? Tesh?
There's, I think if we're talking about the modern republic, I'd say 1960s is the first one, which is...
I think that's a dramatic one.
Yeah, hanging the Prime Minister, Adnan Menderes, and two other key figures around him. I would definitely, we discussed 1980, so that was another.
And 2016.
Yeah, there was the one in 1970, 71. There's also been the postmodern coup in the mid-1990s as well. So,
of course,
that brought down the Islamist government.
So not running out of topics anytime soon.
No.
And Adrian, in the centuries of Ottoman rule, was there any other spectacular... they all killed each other. That was normal, you said.
Well, I think one of the most famous coups is the Petrona Halil revolt in 1730, when the bathhouse-led revolution, which overthrew Ahmed III, the Tulip Age.
Okay.
And so it's a very interesting janissary bathhouse gossip as a colossal, violent revolution. But this happened again in 1808 with the janissaries trying to prevent the reforming sultans. And we have the so-called auspicious event, which was the mass murder of janissaries in the streets of Constantinople.
I can't get away from the stereotypes. I'm trying so hard, but we have a bathhouse revolution in Turkey in 1730. I think we've heard we have to come back. There are many more coups and putsches we need to talk about when it comes to the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. I want to thank you for your time. My name is Oliver Heuter. And I also want to thank my guest today, Teshkan Gümüş.
Mate, it has been absolutely a pleasure for me. Massive learning. So it was hence why there was long moments of silence from me, because I've just been listening to Adrian recount these histories, because it's been fascinating for me.
Professor Adrian Jones, before you say farewell, you have an OAM behind your title for all non-Australians. What does that mean?
That means I'm a member of the Order of Australia, which I got for work in basically community history work on the radio.
Does that mean you're some sort of knight?
Working with curators. No, I'm at the lower level.
You're not a knight yet?
No.
I mean, wow, that's another thing I've just learned about Adrian. So there we go.
And I want to thank you, and please subscribe. Tell your friends and especially your family members in Turkey about us. We need more downloads and support from Turkey. I think today's episode should do the trick for us. And also send us an email to pushcast@gmail.com with any suggestions that you have. Also, if we made a mistake today, point it out and we'll address that next time. Thank you for your time. Bye.